Dr. Joshua Blank, Research Director at the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin. Thank you, as always. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with this meeting that's supposed to take place between the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker of the House over their ongoing month-long dispute, even longer, some might say, over what's the best way to give Texans a break on their property taxes. What do you make of the fact that here we are in the second special session, which is as a result of all this?
Well, I think, one thing to make of it is it's not good for leadership in this state. I think if there's one thing that we tend to think that Republicans can agree on, whether at the state level or the national level, it's tax cuts. And it's really a remarkable state of affairs that we're sitting here after an entire legislative session and now going into the second of two special sessions in which leadership in the state does not seem to be able to come to some sort of an agreement on how to deliver on their very widely promised set of property tax cuts.
And so how do you see this ending? What is going to be the spark? I mean, is the fact that they are even having a meeting a good sign of potential progress?
I mean, only because the relationship between the lieutenant governor and the Speaker of the House is so poor that the reality of them even having a meeting at this point is news. I mean, it's just an indication of how bad that relationship is. I mean, yes, it's a step in the right direction as opposed to not talking. But at the same time, it's actually a pretty clear indication of how acrimonious the relationship is in between those two, that it's even news that they're going to meet on something like this.
And yet when you talk to homeowners about property taxes, et cetera, they always say, well, why aren't they talking? They should be talking.
Well, they should be talking, but the reality is there's a asymmetry in the power dynamic. The lieutenant governor has a lot of power in his chamber, both over the legislation and the votes of the senators, that the Speaker of the House simply does not have. Whereas the lieutenant governor is someone who is a statewide elected official, who has a constituency of his own that is far larger than any individual senator. The Speaker of the House is in effect hired by the House as a manager. And so the Speaker of the House has no ability to simply, snap his fingers or, make a threat and make the House kind of go along with a property tax plan, which is why in reality, I think, the onus in some ways is on the lieutenant governor to make some movement to make this happen.
I was just going to ask you, who has more to lose and how does Governor Abbott figure into all this?
Well, I think everybody has something to lose here. I mean, as I said at the top here, the idea that Republicans can't agree in a state like Texas on how to cut property taxes is a bit of a black eye, and to some extent, could be seen as an inability to govern. Now, it doesn't mean that blame is going to be distributed equally. I think the governor is in a very good position relative to the speaker and the lieutenant governor because the governor is not in charge of the legislative process. If they do come to a compromise, the governor can say, look at the tax cut I delivered you. And if they don't, or it's not adequate, he can point the finger right back at the legislative branch and say, hey, look, they failed. At the same time, within the branch, I think there's sort of an asymmetry in the way that the blame is going to get distributed because the lieutenant governor is so powerful, is a statewide elected official, is far more known than the Speaker of the Texas House, and has really been out on the forefront of this. The longer this goes on, the more ineffective it makes him look. And I think it's a much heavier ask, really, to think that voters are going to start assigning blame to the Speaker of the Texas House because most voters don't know who the Speaker of the Texas House is.
And you recently did a poll, it was last month, and one of the topics that you asked Texans about was the property tax impasse. So break it down for us. What specifically were you asking and what did Texans tell you?
Well, we asked a couple different questions about this, and asking about property taxes can be fairly challenging if you start to think about it a little bit. But what we wanted to know was how voters essentially evaluated the work that state leaders in the legislature did in a number of different policy areas. 16, I think we tested overall. And what we found was total approval for property taxes, their handling of property taxes was at the bottom of the list, tied for the bottom with the work they did on mental health services. This is actually the second session in a row in which the legislature is handling of property taxes ranked at or near the bottom of all the policy areas that they touched during the legislative session. In addition to that, I think most damning really for the legislature at this point, the plurality of voters, almost 50%, still expect their property taxes to go up, despite all of the work that is being put in. Now, look, That could reflect the fact that the legislature has not advanced the property tax issue yet, and that could be in people's minds. But what it does reflect is the fact that polling that we've looked at for the last number of years indicates not only, again, negative evaluations of how the legislature is handling property taxes, but also this expectation that either the things they're doing are not going to have any real impact on people, and that their property taxes are likely to go up.
Well, given that result, what message do you think the people you surveyed are sending to the lawmakers?
Well, I think there's a pretty widespread amount of dissatisfaction. Now, look, this isn't just because of this legislative session. I mean, we've seen a higher levels of dissatisfaction with the direction of the state, with statewide leadership, with state government, really since the end of the 2021 session, to be quite honest. The pandemic was sort of the beginning of this, broad set of discontent coming from all quarters. But I think the last legislative session and its focus on extremely conservative policy goals, and the continuation into this session with a focus on some extremely conservative policy goals, but without maybe making movement on some of these bigger issues, has left a lot of voters with a pretty sour taste in their mouth about the effectiveness of state government at this point.
And another big issue, and we've had to deal with it at some point this summer with all the excruciating hot temperatures out there, is grid reliability.
Mhm.
And so what did you ask and what did folks tell you?
Well, what we found was that fewer than 1 in 5 voters are either extremely or very confident that the legislature has done anything to improve the reliability of the grid. And furthermore, their view is that the efforts that the legislature have made to improve the reliability of the grid are most likely to actually increase the costs that ratepayers pay for electricity. And this has been a big part of this. I mean, ultimately, somebody's going to pay to make the grid more reliable. It could be taxpayers, it could be ratepayers. So in a lot of cases, those are the same people. It could come from other parts of state government. But I think, if you're looking at the discussion kind of following the way that voters are going to react to this, you have a situation in which this issue, which remains a persistent concern of voters since February 2021, is something that they don't think the legislature has fixed. And not only that, they expect to pay more for it going forward. And so I think that's something we have to watch.
I was going to say, isn't that a reasonable expectation? Because the experts have been telling us making the grid more reliable is going to cost more, because before February 2021, the emphasis was on cheap power, cheap energy.
Mhm.
And now the emphasis is on reliability.
I think that's absolutely fair, but I think you also have to consider the fact that we began this legislative session with essentially a party over the humongous budget surplus that Texas was facing. So I think for a lot of voters, what they're wondering is what's being made of that surplus and why they are now being asked to pay more for electric infrastructure, while at the same time not seeing a reduction in their property taxes. I mean, I think the big issue here is that a lot of promises have been made with respect to the money that was available to the legislature this session. And so far, it doesn't seem like voters really feel as though they're getting much of a return on that.
You think the governor and the other leaders, the legislature and ERCOT have a messaging problem?
Do they have a messaging problem? I mean, partially, but I think it's certainly a messaging challenge. I mean, the issue is that this is such a complicated area of policy. You talk to people who really understand this, and they will tell you that most of the people involved in this process do not fully understand the way that we talk about, power generation distribution in the state and the complexities of a market-based system like we have here in Texas. And so what you have is you have an issue area that we call a hard issue. It's not something that we expect voters to have a very complicated understanding of the specific policy mechanisms. And that's why what we're really interested in when we're polling is, what is their feeling? What do they think the impact of this is going to be? Do they think that it's going to be more reliable? And the answer is no. Do they think it's going to cost more? And the answer is yes. And I don't think that that's necessarily a good mix. And whether that comes from a messaging problem or just the realities of electric generation and distribution, it doesn't really matter if you're a statewide political leader. It's a challenge you have to deal with.
And I also wanted to ask you about public policy as it relates to education, because there's still teacher pay raises that are out there. School choice is still out there. Just school finance in general, there's still a lot of questions over. And so what did you ask in this case on this topic, and what did people tell you?
We asked a lot of questions about public education over the course of this legislative session, whether in our February poll or April poll or our June poll, because I mean, as far as sessions that I've been watching have gone, there's rarely been one where I think there have been so many efforts to touch so many different aspects of the state's public education system. But having said that, what you find is that, we've asked people to sort of prioritize the various strains of policy that have been talked about throughout the session. And the thing that voters, consistently prioritize, not surprisingly, was school safety. But it's also the thing that would be the most difficult to show voters that you've done. And so again, when we ask people, how confident are you that state leaders in the legislature have improved the safety of Texas's public schools? And again, you find fewer than 1 in 5 would say that they're extremely or very confident that Texas has done that. Significantly more voters are either not confident or not at all confident they've improved school safety. We also asked about policy areas, 16 different policies in particular that the legislature discussed that were high profile areas. And one of the top polling issues that did not pass was raises for teachers and staff. Overwhelming support from Democrats, independents, and Republicans, nearly 3/4 of each group. And that was something that could not get across the finish line as it was held hostage for other legislative priorities around education. And so I think the question becomes, I think if you're, Republican leadership in the state is, yes, they've delivered a lot of social policy victories with respect to the public schools over the last 2 sessions. But when voters are concerned about whether or not, their kids will have a teacher, right, because of teacher pay and retention issues, or whether it's even safe to go to school, I think all of this other stuff might kind of fall by the wayside.
Did you ask anything about school choice?
Yeah, school choice remains marginally popular. It was what I would say, a slight plurality of Texans say they support, would support basically allowing parents to take state funds to send their kids to some kind of private school or set up an ESA program or a school choice program. But again, I think this is one of those things where, in some ways, the top line result hides some of the complexity on an issue like school choice, which is that it's not a high priority for most voters. And so the reality is that I think most voters look at a question like that, and a small share have very strong either personal commitments to school choice because they have their kids in private school or homeschool their kids, or maybe they hold a strong ideological opposition to school choice based around ideas about public dollars and parochial educations. But most voters don't have kids in public schools. Most voters don't have kids in private school or homeschooled. And so for most voters, the idea is you're looking at a policy like this and you're saying, well, should parents have some more choice? And the answer is probably, get on balance. Sure. Why not? Who doesn't like more choice? But the issue is this a priority for people? And the reality is, I don't think this is a priority for most voters because it's not going to impact most voters in the way that even, parents of kids in public schools and parents of kids generally might be impacted by whether or not there are, teachers, who are willing to work for the pay, and or whether or not the schools that most of the kids in the state are going to are safe.
Wanted to ask you about this issue on state versus local control. We saw that the city of Houston has now filed a lawsuit against the state of Texas over a new law, House Bill 2127, basically limiting how many, what local ordinances can and cannot do. And so you polled people about this, and what did they say?
I mentioned that we tested 16 different specific policy that were addressed by the legislature this session, and the preemption bill, as we worded it in the question. And if you want to look at the specific wording, you go to texaspolitics.utexas.edu and you can find the exact wording of the question. But we found this was the least popular of all of the 16 policies that we tested. And voters were essentially, more or less split on this. Now, I should say, having, done surveys in Texas for many, many years now, and having sort of delved into this issue of what people broadly call local control, for lack of a better term, what you tend to find is that most voters don't have strong feelings about these kinds of issues. They don't necessarily have a deep held view about where the appropriate level of government action should be, whether it should be at the local level, the state level, or the federal level. If they know anything about it, what they really want is they want the level of government to act that will act in the way that they want them to act. So if you have a more conservative policy view, you probably want the state government to act. If you hold more liberal policy views and you live in a city in Texas, you probably think the local government should be the main actor. But given that we know that, the interesting thing that we looked at in this poll was we looked at relative evaluations of both state and local government. And the interesting thing was we didn't really find a lot of antipathy towards local government. And I think, the rhetoric of the session, the impetus behind the preemption bill is this idea that local governments have run amok. There's no evidence of that in the polling. When we look at institutional favorability numbers, whether people have favorable or unfavorable views of national government, federal government, state government, local governments consistently rank higher than state government. When we ask about the honesty or dishonesty of those of local or state government, people tend to think that local government is more honest. And I think tellingly, when we ask people whether the state government or local government mostly addresses or mostly ignores the needs of its residents, many more people are willing to say that local government addresses local needs compared to state government. And so I think one of the more interesting findings in this poll was actually the fact that there wasn't a bunch of negative sentiment towards local governments, which is, I think, if you've been following the legislative session and looking at the impulse behind the preemption bill and its ultimate effect in sort of neutering cities' abilities to pass laws or ordinance or regulate it, this broad range of areas, it's not clear that the voters were clamoring for this.
And my last question to you is just about how Texas leaders are doing. How are they faring job approval wise?
Well, right now, I mean, middling, is what I think I would say overall is the broad thing. And if we look at, polling, and we've been, conducting public polling on state officials, for at least 3 times a year and as many as 6 times a year recently for over a decade. And what we find is, essentially about equal shares of Texans holding positive or negative views of the job performances of most statewide leaders, if they hold views at all. At the same time, that there's one exception to that, and that would be the Attorney General. And there, what we find is that over the period between April and June, when the Attorney General was impeached, his job approvals declined pretty significantly. And most of that decline was due to Republican voters who hadn't really been paying attention to his legal problems at the same level that Democratic voters had. But overall, I think what you'll find is that to the extent that the legislative session ends, it doesn't really necessarily translate to the view that people hold of state leaders very much. And a large part of that is the fact that this game that I think we started talking about earlier, which is who takes credit, who shifts blame, and how good are they at that? And I think the governor is in a very good position to take credit and a lot blame. And I think the lieutenant governor is very willing to do a lot of the same and use his channels to try to do that. And so there's always someone whose fault it is, even if it's not Democrats.
Dr. Joshua Blank, Research Director at the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.